go over here. Gentleman right there.
Thank you. Mr. Jaitley, I think taking a different lens now at the relationship, looking at the economic relationship, I think some of the reforms that your government had instituted, patent reforms, Insurance Act amendments and things, really did help build a solid support from the United States side from the business community. There's a few other reforms that are in motion right now, Insurance Act, banking, retail trade. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you see as the possibilities for those areas to open up, which could unlock a new, I think, wave of investment from American companies.
See, when I come to these specific areas you're asking a question, I'll only urge you, as far as the reform process is concerned, to keep one broad parameter in mind. The number of people in India who live below the poverty line is still very large. Therefore, India is a democracy which became independent in 1947. And at a time through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s where democracies world over being toppled through army dictatorships, to other coups, etc., India at least has a distinction, despite being a little less than developing economy at that time, to literally get strengthened in its democratic values with every day that passed. We only had a small aberration in the mid-70s. Therefore, always bear in mind when we speak of the reform process in India, it's an economy where a very large number of people have still not tasted the fruits of economic development and growth. So economic reform in societies like ours is necessary. We in my party are committed to it. But at the same time, economic reform is also an art of the possible. Therefore, to be able to push an economic reform in an Indian society, despite all this, so you're a democracy where reforms at times, because they immediately don't benefit every man, and some perceive it as only beneficial to the few, therefore a resistance picks up. We are a divided democracy in the sense that any government of the day, my government didn't have a majority in the upper house, the present government didn't have a majority in the upper house. And therefore a large amount of cooperation between various parties is required. And therefore economic reforms in India always is an art of the possible. Now from 1991 to 2004, slowly but surely every successive government, and you had three different shades of government. You had the Congress government, you had the United Front government, you had the NDA government, slowly but surely moved in the direction of reforms. Some reforms have slowed down post-2004. So the present government in power, when they were in power from 91 to 96, their speed of reform was far more than what it's been now. I think it will depend a lot on the government-opposition dialogue as to how fast this can happen. The government has not even seriously begun this dialogue. But I can only indicate to you that one important reform came on the last day of the last session of Parliament, which was the pension law in India. Now, the pension law was likely to be defeated at the time of introduction itself, let alone being debated in Parliament, because there was a section which was showing great opposition. The government hadn't done its homework and didn't have the numbers to even introduce the bill. Now, it was at this stage that my party took an impromptu decision on the floor of the House to get up and support the government on the pension bill, and we saved the bill. And now, hopefully, as and when it comes, with or without changes, it may move a little forward. I think India broadly is committed to reforms. The speed of the reform depends on the will of the government of the day on that given day. I can't say in the abstract what is the shape of a particular legislation which will come. Some of these laws that you've spoken about, at least one of them was introduced when we were in power. And therefore, the pension law was, for instance, debated for the first time when we were in power. And that's why we felt it was important that even if the present government is bringing it, we must at least make sure that the bill doesn't lose out on the very opening day. We are a responsible opposition, so we'll judge each one of these steps. But some of the steps that you've mentioned may not be so easy because there are strong domestic opinions with regard to the situation within India, which are not still favorably inclined to that. So the government of the day will have to assess those situations.
Anyone want to add anything?
Sir,
Would you like to add anything?
not to this, I think
Okay,
Mr. Jaitley has
okay.
been very comprehensive, but I'll take any further questions. So,
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
All right, let's go back over here. Does anybody over here have a question? Trying to get geographic distribution here. You're right here, sir.
Thank you. First of all, Mr. Jaitley, let me say how much I appreciated your positive remarks about the implementation of the deal. Certainly, none of the fears about how the nuclear deal could adversely impact India's nuclear weapons program have been borne out. That is, there's been no impact whatsoever on India's strategic program from the deal. But the one issue that continues to hang over this from a Washington perspective is the question of how to fulfill the positive promise of the deal, specifically in terms of attracting international investment to India's civil nuclear sector and expanding the availability of civilian nuclear power in India through the presence of American and other international companies. This became wrapped up last fall in the question of the nuclear liability law. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how best the government in Delhi might be able to navigate around these issues now. And I would just underline, from a U.S. government standpoint, we certainly have no wish to inject ourselves into what you properly note as a complicated domestic scenario. It's the Indian Parliament and the government of the day that has to work its way through this. But certainly for the U.S. government, our bottom line wish is to see the participation of American companies in India's nuclear power sector, because that will be good for us commercially, but it's also good for you in terms of our desire to see India's economy continue to grow with nuclear power as a significant part of that equation.
See, the nuclear, I'll just make a comment before, you want to say something?
Yeah, I'll say, you just broad point you make.
See, the nuclear liability law obviously was required once the deal became a done deal and a reality, irrespective of one's opinions on some aspects of the deal. Since the government of the day had decided upon it, the liability law itself was essential, because once you operationalize the deal, then what happens in the event of some unforeseen situation taking place? Now, since there was a divided opinion on the deal itself in India, at one stage there was a likelihood of a strong opposition to the liability law itself. Now, it was at that stage, it was one of those instances that in fact, while speaking on it, I mentioned in the Indian Parliament that the law was introduced as a textbook example of how it should not have been introduced, but the manner in which the discussions between the opposition and the government took place and a consensus legislation came out itself was a good example eventually. Therefore, every clause of this bill was both in and outside Parliament as a part of the legislative debate and informal consultations between the opposition and the government. So every word of it was seen through the microscope. In fact, after it was cleared, there were some parties, the left parties, which still did vote against the bill. But eventually the bill was passed with a much wider consensus. And that's one response to what Sadanan also had asked. My party and all our alliance partners, in fact, eventually supported the amended draft. So the government and we voted together. This is one of those cases where a consensus on a legislation had developed, but after some changes were brought out. I'm conscious of the fact that there is one clause on which some people, particularly in the United States, had some questions. But I can assure you that we've examined it both in the government and opposition, and the Indian Parliament, after considering all aspects, has passed it. Some of the fears may not be what are being expressed. And that is why the initial response from what I hear from the government of the suppliers, at least from some areas, has begun, and I'm sure that others within the United States and elsewhere who want to become suppliers of film will also realize that it's a fairly safe regime to invest in.